Millbrook was the kind of town where secrets had a very short life. With barely 4,000 people living within its borders, news traveled faster than the morning wind. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone watched everyone. And on a warm Tuesday afternoon, when a 77-year-old man named Daniel Harper quietly raised his hand at the county foreclosure auction and bought a crumbling, abandoned house for just $3, the entire room erupted in laughter. The house at 142 Willow Lane had been empty for years. Its roof sagged like the shoulders of a tired old man who had given up on standing straight. The walls inside were stained dark with decades of rainwater that had found its way through every crack and broken shingle. The yard was nothing more than cracked, dry earth, weeds pushing through the dirt like they owned the place, which, in every practical sense, they did. The windows were clouded with grime. The front steps leaned sideways at an angle that suggested they had already decided to fall and were simply waiting for the right moment. A contractor sitting in the back row of the auction hall leaned over to his friend and chuckled loud enough for several people to hear. $3? That old man just bought himself the worst house in all of Millbrook. The laughter spread quickly. A few people covered their mouths out of politeness. Others did not bother. Even the auctioneer allowed himself a small smile as he stamped the paperwork. Daniel Harper did not respond to any of it. He stood up slowly, folded the deed with steady hands, slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, and walked out of the courthouse with the calm, unhurried steps of a man who knew something that nobody else in that room did. He did not look back. He did not explain himself. He simply walked into the afternoon sunlight, got into his old car, and drove home. What nobody in that auction room knew was that Daniel had spent 40 years of his life as a structural engineer. He had looked at broken buildings the way a doctor looks at a sick patient, not with disgust, but with understanding. He could see what lay beneath the damage. He could read the bones of a structure the way other men read a newspaper. And when he had walked through that ruined house 2 days before the auction, alone, with a small flashlight and his experienced eyes, he had seen something that made his chest tighten with a feeling he had not felt in a very long time. The bones of the house were strong. Beneath the sagging roof and the stained walls and the broken steps, the foundation was solid. The main beams were thick old oak that had not rotted. The structure, underneath all its suffering, was still standing with dignity. It only needed someone who believed in it enough to peel away the damage and reveal what was underneath. But that was only half of what Daniel had seen. The other half was the address itself, 142 Willow Lane. He had stared at those numbers on the auction listing for a long time before he had even looked at the photographs, because he remembered that address. He remembered it the way a person remembers the face of someone they loved deeply and lost without wanting to. He had not told Margaret yet. When he arrived home that afternoon, his wife of 53 years was sitting in her favorite chair by the window, a worn novel open in her lap, the afternoon sun resting softly on her silver hair. She looked peaceful. She looked exactly like herself. Margaret Harper at 75 had the kind of quiet beauty that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with a life lived with patience and grace. "Did you get the furnace filter?" she asked without looking up, because she knew the sound of his footsteps the way she knew her own heartbeat. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he walked to the coffee table and placed a single sheet of paper on top of her novel. She looked down at it. Her hands went still. The air seemed to leave the room. The address printed at the top of the deed was 142 Willow Lane. She did not speak for almost a full minute. When she finally did, her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Daniel, that is our first house." 52 years ago, when they were 23 and 25 years old, when they were young and had very little money but more hope than they knew what to do with, they had lived at 142 Willow Lane for exactly 2 years. It was where they had built their first life together, where they had painted walls the wrong color and laughed about it,
where they had eaten meals on the floor because they could not yet afford a proper table, where Daniel had carved 3 small initials into the wooden frame of the kitchen doorway on the night they moved in, pressing the knife slowly into the wood while Margaret stood behind him with a candle because the electricity had not yet been switched on. DMH.
Daniel Margaret Harper. They drove to Willow Lane together that evening, just before the sun went down. They parked across the street and sat in the car for a while without speaking, looking at the house through the windshield. It looked worse than either of them had remembered, or perhaps worse than the memory they had carried of it, which had always been softer and warmer than the reality. But Margaret opened the car door and walked toward it. She moved through the overgrown yard slowly, and then, in a gesture that Daniel did not fully understand at first, she crouched down and pressed her fingers into the soil near the base of the old fence. She stayed like that for a moment, feeling the earth between her fingers. "The soil is rich," she said quietly. Daniel came and stood beside her. "How can you possibly tell that?" She looked up at him and smiled, a small, private smile, the kind that carries a whole story behind it. Because there was something about Margaret Harper that most people, even people who had known her for decades, did not know. Before she became a wife, before she became a mother, before life arranged itself around her and filled every hour with the needs of other people, Margaret had earned a degree in landscape architecture. She had graduated at the top of her class. Her professor had told her she had a rare gift, not just for designing spaces, but for understanding the relationship between land and light and water and living things. He had told her she would do something remarkable. But then she had married Daniel, and they had moved for his career, and then the children had come, and the years had followed one after another, each one full and demanding and genuinely good, but none of them leaving room for the dream that had been quietly folded up and put away sometime in her mid-20s. She had not spoken of it in decades. She was not even certain Daniel remembered that it had ever existed. Standing in the ruined yard of the first home they had ever shared, with dark, rich soil on her fingertips and the evening light falling golden through the overgrown weeds, Margaret Harper felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been shut for 50 years, opening just a crack and letting in a thin line of light. Within 2 days, all of Millbrook was talking. At the diner on Main Street, people shook their heads over their coffee cups. At their age, that house, what were they thinking? Their son Robert called from Chicago, his voice carrying the
particular exhausted frustration of a child who believes his parents have finally lost their grip on good judgment. Their daughter Emily was less diplomatic. She said the house should simply be demolished before it fell on someone. Even the mayor of Millbrook drove past it slowly one afternoon, looked at it with visible displeasure, and made a phone call that resulted in a code inspector arriving at the property with a clipboard and an expression of official concern. Daniel met the inspector at the door and handed him a folder. Inside the folder were every permit required by the county: foundation repair, roof replacement, full electrical update, plumbing inspection approval. Everything organized, everything legal. Everything prepared with the quiet thoroughness of a man who had spent 4 decades making sure structures were sound before anyone else touched them. The inspector left without a word, and Daniel went back inside and picked up his tools. He worked every day, not frantically, not with the desperate energy of someone trying to prove a point, but steadily, methodically, with the deep patience of a man who understood that good work cannot be rushed. He pulled away the damaged boards and found strong ones beneath. He replaced the roof shingles one section at a time. He rewired the electrical with the help of a licensed electrician he had worked with years ago, who came out of retirement for a week just because Daniel had asked. He restored the oak floors by hand, sanding them in the evenings until they gleamed warm and golden under the new light fixtures. Outside, Margaret was doing something else entirely. She had bought a sketchbook. She sat in the yard every morning with her coffee and the sketchbook on her knees, and she drew. She mapped the way the sunlight moved across the yard from east to west throughout the day. She measured the slope of the land and designed terraced garden beds that would follow its natural contours rather than fight against them. She planned a small rain garden near the fence line that would capture and slowly absorb the storm water that had been flooding the street every spring for years. She sketched out a wildflower meadow for the far corner, choosing varieties that would bloom in succession from early April all the way through October, so that there would always be something alive and colorful, no matter the season. She designed stone pathways that curved gently through the beds, wide enough to walk comfortably, laid in a pattern that invited a person to slow down and look around. One afternoon, Daniel came outside to take a break and found her surrounded by sketches. He picked one up and studied it for a long time. "Margaret," he said slowly, "this is professional-level work." She took a sip of her coffee. "It always was," she said simply. Most of their neighbors watched from behind curtains. A few watched from their porches with folded arms. The general opinion on Millbrook's quieter streets was that the whole project was either admirable in a foolish way or foolish in an admirable way, and people were not entirely sure which. But one morning, an elderly woman named Helen Brooks, who had lived directly across the street from 142 Willow Lane for 30 years, put on her garden gloves and walked across the road. She stood in front of Margaret and looked at the sketchbook. "You need help?" she asked. Margaret looked up, genuinely surprised. "I didn't think anyone around here cared much about what we were doing." Helen shrugged with the directness of someone who had lived long enough to be done with anything unnecessary. "I don't care what anyone thinks. I care about hard work when I see it." They began laying the first stone pathway together that same afternoon, stone by stone, slow and careful and exact. Two old women on their knees in the dirt, fitting stones together with the focused quiet of people who understand that some things cannot be hurried. And for the first time since Daniel had folded that deed and put it in his coat pocket, 142 Willow Lane no longer looked abandoned. It looked like somewhere someone had chosen to begin again. Spring turned into summer. The roof stopped leaking. The floors shone. The porch steps stood straight and level. The yard transformed week by week in a way that made people slow their cars as they passed, then stop entirely, then lower their windows to look more carefully. Wildflowers swayed in the warm air. Stone paths curved through beds of color. Butterflies moved through the lavender in slow, unhurried loops. The rain garden along the fence had already, in its first season, reduced the street flooding that had irritated the neighborhood for a decade. People who had laughed at the option now stood on the sidewalk in silence, looking at something they had not expected and could not quite find the right words for. Exactly 1 year after Daniel Harper had folded that deed in the courthouse and walked out into the sunlight, the mayor of Millbrook came back to Willow Lane. He did not come with a code inspector this time. He came alone, in the early evening, and he stood on the sidewalk for a long while without speaking. The house was not grand, it was not large. It was still only 420 square feet of modest, simple space. But it was alive in a way that made everything around it feel more alive. Margaret was in the garden, her hands in the soil, trimming back the lavender with quiet satisfaction. Daniel sat on the porch with a glass of water, watching the light change over the yard he had watched his wife bring back to life. The mayor finally said, his voice carrying something that sounded like genuine humility, "I think we were wrong about you two." Daniel looked at him for a moment. "We weren't trying to prove anyone wrong," he said. Margaret did not look up from her work. "We were just finishing something we started 50 years ago," she said.
The mayor nodded slowly and walked back to his car. Some dreams are not lost. They are only waiting. Waiting through the years of raising children and building careers and meeting the endless daily demands of a life fully lived. Waiting with the patience that only a true dream can sustain. And sometimes, when the moment finally arrives, when an old deed lands on a coffee table and an address whispers itself into two people's hearts, even a $3 broken house can become the place where everything that was folded away finally, quietly, beautifully blooms.